Thank you, Hans. So I'm sure all of you are experiencing this thanks to the Paris Agreement, Al Gore, Greta, perhaps even Trump and Biden, and of course the relentless flow of numbers and figures that provide proof of global warming. There's a sense of urgency. Urgency to reduce energy consumption or change the way we use energy and stimulate the use of renewable energy. So you might think actually that things are going well. And what we did for the past years is that we analyzed dozens of business models of entrepreneurs working in the energy market. We conducted at least as many interviews with them, read up on all the relevant theories out there on transition management, entrepreneurship, etc. And performed research on the characteristics of the markets that these entrepreneurs operate in. And all of this has been part of a project or so-called Annex under the Technology Collaboration Program, User-Centered Energy Systems that Sam Thomas will talk a little bit more about right after my presentation. So, as I said, you might think that with all this attention to energy reduction, climate change, etc., and the energy transition in general, you could easily imagine actually that doing business in this market is an easy ticket to success. However, there is a very slow market uptake of these innovations and business models. And what we have been concluding is, among others, and built on the fact that successful companies in the current energy sector have one thing in common. What we have witnessed is that those businesses out there and business models out there that are more successful than others are the service-oriented ones. I'm going to explain a little bit more what this servitization actually means in the next slide. But actually nowadays, in many sectors, there is hardly any value proposition or solution that is purely a product or product oriented. Almost every solution out there is a combination of products and services, or even a service only proposition. And what we see is that the businesses and the entrepreneurs that deliver these services successfully have a certain set of right capabilities. They are really good at sensing the user needs, but also really good at sensing context around their business model and their solution and around their users. And they're really good at sensing the system around them and how it is in a transitioning way at the moment. They are really good at scaling and stretching, so upscaling, but also stretching in the sense that in their internal business, they are able to reorganize everything such that the whole business is tuned actually into delivering a service. Delivering a service, furthermore, requires usually that you propose a combination of products and services, not always yours. So there's a lot of orchestration going on in those successful businesses in terms of getting all the partners aligned, all their propositions, system integration, etc. And what we see, especially in those service-oriented business models, is that the scale or capability of conceptualizing, which means being able to actually iteratively innovate and change your value proposition based on what comes out of the feedback loops that you have installed, sensing the user needs also in the use phase, is a key skill. So, as I promised, a little bit more in depth what the difference is between a product-oriented business model and a service-oriented business model. On the left, you see the product-oriented business model. And most of you will be familiar with this type of model. The partners are in a value chain relationship with the business developer. The resources are very much technologically oriented well, software, etc. The value proposition is usually a product that you unpack that is being delivered at home. And what's really important also in its difference with a business service-oriented business model is the relationship with the users or the clients. The product-oriented business model is usually a one-off, so it's focused on the whole process up to the transaction, and after the transaction usually the business developers prefer not to have any contact anymore, because usually it's about complaints. The revenue system is the paper unit, paper product type of model. When we talk about the service-oriented business model, we talk about a completely different business model. So actually, the partners are not so much your value chain partners. They are the partners that you need to actually provide a service throughout the whole value journey of the customer. So it's about strategic collaboration, usually in the form of an ecosystem. And the suppliers are not only suppliers, they are usually also co-creators of the proposition. And very often even the users are co-creating partners as well. The activities, they are focused on long term, and they include, amongst others, relationship building. They are focused on improvement of the delivery of the service, for example, also through training or education, all aimed at maximizing the value. So the resources are also different. They consist, for example, of much more of knowledge, capabilities, people, all of them focused on enabling deep customer understanding and sensing. And the value proposition, of course, is really different. It's described in the value for the user and in the value during the use phase. So it's of course very often based also on delivering a product, but also a process at the same time. And it's tailor-made, it's customized, it's focused on usability, solving a problem or meeting a need. And the value is very often immaterial, so you cannot really unpack it. It's not a product in itself. And the value is stated in outcomes and experience instead of, for example, outputs such as the kilowatt hours used or reduced with the product. And the transaction is not the end of the relationship, it's actually the start of a much longer relationship with the end user. Again, as I said before, with the user very often also co-creating the service. And the revenue structure is, of course, pay per unit, and that's very different. It's much more in the form of a fee, for example. So we interviewed many business developers out there that are trying to deliver an energy service, ranging from, for example, a microgrid to a smart thermostat, or a software platform for energy exchange amongst people, customers, for example, in an energy community. So wide-ranging set of cases out there. And what's interesting is that when interviewing them, we actually found a pattern in what they identified as the barriers that they encounter while running their business. And we identified 5 system barriers that even the most successful entrepreneurs needed to deal with and incorporate in some way into their business model. So it's complexity, it's orchestrated irresponsibility or lack of leadership out there, uncertainty in its widest form, contestation in the sense that facts are not agreed upon by all, directions to take are not agreed upon. And what they all experienced is that the system very often feels like a very technocratic block. I will go into detail for each of these 5 barriers. But what is important to notice is that all of these barriers are actually natural or organic outcomes of a system in transition. You would find them not only in the energy market being in transition, but in any type of transitioning system. So it's something actually that all the entrepreneurs out there are to deal with to some extent, and some of them are quite successful at it and some are less. I will come back to that a bit further on in the presentation. So let me discuss with you the first system barrier that these entrepreneurs are facing and are dealing with in their business model: complexity. So it cannot be denied, I think, that the whole energy transition field is really complex. And we have decided to use this word complex on purpose. So it's not a field of difficult problems, it's a field of complex problems. And just to provide you with some characteristics of this complexity, the business developers, entrepreneurs out there, they need to deal with many different or heterogeneous stakeholders, all of them having their own concerns about the energy transition and the position of the innovation or service being developed. Actually, it's really difficult to pinpoint for entrepreneurs what type of problem they are solving. There's not a really clear boundary that can be defined as the problem. Very often they need to solve multiple problems for those multiple stakeholders out there. And everything is interconnected. So that means that a change that they might be able to realize in one element of the system actually connects to a lot of adjacent systems, and they start moving as well, which creates increasing complexity. And everything changes over time. There is actually not really stability. To some extent, of course, I mean, the whole system is built around stability. It doesn't want to change by itself, but there are changes over time. And what's interesting to notice is that despite numerous attempts at managing the system, managing the energy transition, scientists, but also policy actors have had to conclude that this complexity cannot be controlled, it cannot be tamed, and it certainly cannot be solved. At most, what you can do is actually unravel it, understand it, and that's being done to some extent, but to be honest, what we see is that a lot of methods and instruments that are used out there to actually control complexity or minimize complexity are increasing the problem. The next barrier that those entrepreneurs experience when they try to create uptake for their service is organized irresponsibility or lack of leadership, lack of one party, so to say, among all the stakeholders out there that is able and willing to take leadership in how to proceed with the energy transition. And that has, of course, to do with the complex character of the problem and due to the heterogeneous group of stakeholders. So not one of them is actually responsible for the situation and does not want to take responsibility. But that also means that as a consequence, there is no overarching collaboration strategy. And each stakeholder is actually developing individual measures, individual regulations that are not aligned. And this leads to a situation where entrepreneurs have to deal very often with conflicting schemes, rules, laws, procedures. And what you see happening, I will come back to that later a bit more in depth, is that those entrepreneurs that are really successful, they take the lead, they become a front runner in actually taking leadership and moving the transition forward. But they do so not because they want to, but because they need to, as response to the lack of leadership shown by, for example, governments on different levels, also municipalities. Uncertainty is the third barrier that a lot of entrepreneurs are facing, and especially I think you can imagine that with entrepreneurs designing services for the energy transition, it's really difficult to invest a lot of time and money into a service when you don't know exactly where the transition is going to, what kind of technological route is going to be chosen, etc. So in fact, what they are doing, much more than in more stable markets, is that they are innovating without knowing upfront if their outcome is also within reach. They don't know if preset goals are going to be met. And what you see happening is also that they are facing a lot of issues, because on the one hand, they have to deal with uncertainty. On the other hand, the whole system asks them in terms of investors and the bank, etc., for smart indicators, but they don't fit uncertainty. And a lot of those entrepreneurs, they still need to do a lot of learning along the way, but that is usually also not accepted by the system as it is, as a okay way of doing business. So this is really an issue that they struggle with a lot. They need to experiment, but the whole system is not allowing for experimentation, in spite of the fact that there is no clear direction to go to. The fourth barrier that these entrepreneurs have to deal with is contestation. So, as mentioned before, in this field of the energy transition, there is a very large and diverse group of actors that plays a role, and each of them, they use their own instruments, they speak their own language. For example, a chief technology officer is likely to frame problems as technological, whereas a businessman might frame issues more as market failure or an issue of profit and loss, and they don't speak each other's language. And obviously also a lot of those stakeholders, they don't even know that they are talking from a specific perspective or paradigm, and they are not sensitive also to the fact that others might come from a different paradigm. In addition, related to the complexity and the uncertainty and the lack of leadership, what you often see is that around the more innovative type of business models out there and innovation, services, products, etc., there's also contestation as to whether those are the right things to do, the right things to develop. So what happens is that a lot of those entrepreneurs are actually, they think they're all in the business of saving the climate and the goal, but actually they're completely lost in translation. So this is one really big issue also to a lot of them, that they need to somehow deal with and change in their business model. And then the last system barrier that all of them in one way or the other have identified is the fact that once they need to start interacting with the system, it feels very much like a very technocratic block. So there's first of all the very technocratic push of instruments that are brought into the game. So rules, procedures, schemes, they're all created to stimulate or regulate the market. But the big issue is that the vast majority of these rules and procedures, they are designed like a product, and even more so, they are mainly designed for a product, and then also a product, a individual product. So anything that goes into system integration or service is actually out of scope almost for a lot of regulations and incentives. So we see, for example, a lot of subsidy schemes out there that do not allow for services to be developed, in the sense that there is no subsidy for process costs, transaction costs, and certainly not for experimentation, which actually is something that needs to be done also in light of this uncertainty and gaining more certainty. And then there is the fact that the system is very technocratic also, in the sense that it has a very individual or individualistic approach also. I mentioned it before. There's hardly any collaboration overarching in terms of the instruments being deployed. So there's a lot of, for example, regulation in the field of energy can be very conflicting with regulation in another field. And this is not something that really helps the entrepreneurs out there. However, what we saw is that entrepreneurs are different, of course, and they also have different entrepreneurial strategies to deal actually with this system and the barriers that they are encountering. So all of them, they design a service-oriented business model, but how they design also the business model to deal with the 5 barriers is different. Some ignore the 5 barriers altogether. Some try to follow as much as possible what the system is doing. So they are lagging a little bit behind, following the flock, so to say. But there are also a different subset of entrepreneurs out there that actually see the system barriers, the lack of leadership, the uncertain directions, the complexity that everyone struggles with, actually as a market opportunity or even a potential problem that they can solve with their business model. And they aim willingly to actually reconfigure the system. And those are really interesting types of entrepreneurs out there, so-called institutional entrepreneurs. Why? Because they do institutional work. So they actually help create regulation, for example. They help set up collaborative governance programs. They help create certainty and direction, or their business model is all about taking leadership and demonstrating leadership, and then going towards cooperation between different heterogeneous stakeholders. So they make the 5 barriers their business in a way. I'm not going to go into detail in those cases. I don't have the time for that, but you can find all of the cases that we have analyzed on the web page for the Annex in, I think, 1 month time. There are already a lot of reports that you can read, for example, about institutional entrepreneurship, and the case studies will follow quickly. But just to highlight one, to give you an example of such an institutional entrepreneur, we have Mimo from Australia. And Mimo is actually a microgrid electricity market operator service. It's being developed by the University of Monash. And what they have been doing is knowing that, for example, the state out there did not yet have a lot of regulation put in place to allow, for example, for microgrids, and certainly not for valuing the flexibility being provided, for example, by residents, or in this case also retailers to the grid. They started developing this market operator service, actually providing value to those delivering flexibility, and advising the government as to what they were experiencing while experimenting with this business model, this service, and getting the state of Victoria to actually design their policies around the lessons learned from this experiment, which was actually a very, very interesting approach, which has helped a lot of other microgrids out there to experience much less problems. We have several of those microgrid cases actually in our database. But this is a clear example where actually this entrepreneur, of course, this is a university, but they made a commercial business case out of it, became almost a policy entrepreneur, or almost. They became a policy entrepreneur, did institutional work, furthering the energy transition in a way. So we analyzed those cases out there that really demonstrated institutional entrepreneurship. And what we found is that they require additional capabilities on top of the sensing, conceptualizing, orchestrating capabilities that I mentioned earlier as being servitization capabilities. And what we witnessed is that they were, for example, really good at managing complexity by creating collaborative work processes and creating multiple value in their value proposition to multiple stakeholders. So really aligning actually the interest of multiple stakeholders so that they could start working together instead of individualistically and often counterproductively. They demonstrated leadership, orchestrating again what needed to be done or where needed. So, for example, the MIMO case I just demonstrated really fulfilled an intermediary role that was not yet there in the market. And we have other cases, for example, in Ireland, the CFI case, Carbon Fund Ireland, that really took up an intermediary role, designing a new facilitator type of service. They know how to deal with uncertainty by anticipating it, negotiating directions, and co-creating actually with relevant stakeholders what the roads would be, the pathways would be. And at the same time, allowing for flexible and iterative outcomes instead of preset goals. And finding the investors and the banks and the insurance companies willing to actually undertake the journey with them. In terms of the contestation barriers, again, they were able to conceptualize all of these and turn them in a proposition, a value proposition that actually mediated or span across all of those interests. So that's very much related also to what they did around complexity. And in terms of this technocracy issue, they really were able to unravel the system into individual actors that they could talk to, establish long-term relationship with, and work with or around in a sense. So let me discuss this a little bit further. There's a report also that you can read on our Annex website that demonstrates that this typical activities or skills of these institutional entrepreneurs are all to be seen as agency, and that this agency, so to put it in plain words, the ability to actually do what you want and change the system around you relies on three really important key elements. The resources available to these entrepreneurs, the discourses, so the stories, the narratives out there, and the ones that they are creating and how they relate to them, and their social position. This is all based on work done prior by a lot of researchers out there. In the report you can read much more about it. But just to go into more detail on the resources, for example, what we saw is that the entrepreneurs really demonstrating the ability or the agency to do institutional work, they were able to draw on intellectual resources, on authority type of resources, both formal and informal authority, and of course, economic resources. But they were also really good at, as I said before, linking to the discourses out there. So they were able to create a new story on the energy transition and the solution they brought to the problems of this energy transition. And they really were able to mine or create a specific social position in a social network, both in an informal manner, but also organizational manner and on the institutional level. So they became, for example, strategic partners for policymaking. All of this can be turned into a model of agency. You can read all about it more in the report that I discussed earlier or mentioned earlier. But what I would like to do as a final section of this presentation is actually also turn it around. We know what entrepreneurs can do. We know what a lot of them are doing out there, those especially that really provide the more radical type of innovations, and aim to be reconfigurators of the system or creators of the future system. We know what they can do, what they should do, but still it's really difficult for a lot of them to actually do it. So not all good service companies can actually help realize the system change or drive them, but there's so much potential out there. So what we did in our work is we turned the question around and we started asking what could actually the system players, so policymakers, banks, insurance companies, innovation agencies, etc., do to help these type of entrepreneurs that are so potentially so valuable for the energy transition become more successful. And the answer is actually the same answer that we would give to entrepreneurs out there asking, okay, what do I need to do to become more successful, have a better market uptake in the energy market, is become more service oriented. And we tried also to narrow it down a little bit in the sense of, okay, we have those 5 system barriers that the entrepreneurs are experiencing. What could system players do to help these entrepreneurs navigate around those 5 system barriers? So when we talk about the complexity issue, what we actually think is that those entrepreneurs are much better served when complexity is actually embraced also by the system players instead of being controlled. So that the system players explore how the system and subsystems are interrelated, and what kind of new combinations and fruitful collaborations could be set up in terms of cross-boundary combinations, lowering the silos between a lot of disciplines, for example, but also silos between different governmental departments, so that there is much more collaboration embracing complexity. So this is really something that system players out there could do on the level of their organization, but also on the level of the rules and regulations and other kind of support schemes that they are developing out there. In terms of this lack of leadership or organized irresponsibility that the entrepreneurs are experiencing, in one sentence, what should happen is actually that system players, and perhaps even more so the public authorities out there, should work much more towards providing a driving role, taking a first step towards collaborative governance. So they don't need to take leadership on their own and do everything on their own, but be the leader in designing more collaborative governance. So that means, for example, driving the creation of policy instruments that are service supporting. I already mentioned a few of those examples where a lot of the incentives and subsidy schemes are focused on products or individual technological components instead of system integration or process. They could also create incentives and places that are focused on experimenting. And that also means that they need to follow a process approach, a program approach, where they allow for uncertain outcomes and learning, and provide clear structures for sharing these learnings with further initiatives. It also means that, for example, they should think about developing new metrics that allow for unknown outcomes. I mean, a lot of the incentives out there and the subsidy schemes and financial schemes out there, they demand very clear outputs. But actually, we're talking about experiments and learning. And if you actually realize your preset goals, one could say you have failed. So it's really about redesigning a different set of metrics and a different set of risk attribution as well, because at this moment, actually, the cost and the risks of learning are borne solely by the initiators, which are very often entrepreneurs or citizens. In terms of dealing with the uncertainty out there, what we see is that the system players could actually appreciate the uncertainty and acknowledge that not knowing and open ends are actually the reality of the transition that they operate in. So there's still very much a persistent need somehow for a lot of those system players out there for clearly defined projects with preset goals and a true or false outcome. But dynamic programming with a process approach is actually much more fruitful for this learning, and would actually lead to much better quality of the process and the interactions in that process. But that also means, as I said before, a process approach, which also requires a long-term focus, which is of course a challenge to a lot of the more policy-oriented players out there. And it also means much more orchestration and facilitation of multi-stakeholder collaborative processes, really building relationships in a sense that are multi-level, intersectoral, and focused on creating multiple value. And it really calls for intensive evaluation and monitoring and learning. In terms of the contestation, so the different languages and the different facts that are acknowledged as facts, it's really important that alignment is created, defining a common vision, an overarching outcome, a story, a narrative that more people, more players can actually relate to. And that also means very often, I'm not going to repeat it because it's something I've said a lot now. Again, those process focus needs to be in place, and the focus on experimentation, etc., and allowing for the fact that there is not one truth out there. It also, for example, requires that the support schemes out there or training schemes out there, for example, focus on creating and training collaborative skills and co-creation. So instead of a true or false, fact or fiction type of approach to the words being used and the numbers being used, etc., it's more about co-creating a common future. And then finally, the technocratic block and how to become more service oriented there, allowing for entrepreneurs to become more successful. This is really an issue because, my God, that really rough and bureaucratic and frustrating journey a lot of entrepreneurs face is really, really problematic. So it's very much about, again, embracing complexity, defining this common overarching outcome, developing policy instruments that are collaborating instead of counterproductive, and that are service supporting instead of product oriented, and again, the new metrics. So this is it. I know that this last part was probably more abstract and overarching than the first part, but we are exploring. We're exploring where to go, what kind of recommendations also to give to the system players to allow for a more supportive system out there for those entrepreneurs that can really make a difference in the energy transition. If you want to contact us, all the details are here for the participating countries. The national experts are listed. And then I think prior to the Q&A, I gave the floor to Sam from the users TCP, who will explain a little bit more about this TCP.